Let the sample sit at room temperature for 2 minutes. Centrifuge the samples again at 14,000 rotations per minute for 5 minutes. Again, the mark should be faced outside for screw cap tubes, and for the microcentrifuge tubes, the opening should be facing inwards. After the centrifugation, discard the supernatants. But be careful not to discard the pellet as well. Centrifuge the tubes again at 14,000 rotations per minute for 1 minute. Then use a micropipette tip to pipette the rest of the solvent in the tube. When pipetting, please be careful to only pipette away the solvent and nothing else. Then allow the tubes to sit open capped at room temperature for another 2 minutes. This is a bottle of solution 3. Change the setting of the pipette to 30 microliters and then add 30 microliters of solution 3 into each of the samples. After, vortex each of the microcentrifuge tubes for 10 seconds. Then, centrifuge the tubes for 10 seconds. After centrifugation, we now move on to the steps for PCR amplification. First, thaw the PCR master mix to room temperature. Then, spin down all the PCR reagents. Then, pipette 23.25 microliters of PCR master mix into each of the PCR tubes. An alternative method would be to prepare a mixture of the PCR master mix and DNA tag polymerase for the total number of tests that you'd be performing. Please refer to page 9 for a table of volume requirements for the corresponding number of tests. After the addition of PCR master mix, add 0.75 microliters of DNA tag polymerase to each of the PCR reaction tubes. Setting the pipette to 1 microliter, pipette 1 microliter of the sample solution from the top half of the volume into the corresponding PCR tubes for PCR amplification. Remember to label all the PCR reaction tubes with a permanent marker. Then centrifuge the PCR tubes for a few seconds. Place the PCR reaction tubes into the thermocycler. Change the settings of the thermal cycler to the ones found on page 7 of the instruction protocol. Then you can start the PCR process.